I took at Michigan State University was with a very famous professor on campus named Lash LaRue. His name was actually Charles P. LaRue or C. Patrick LaRue, but he was a wonderful professor. So we took this labor history class. Now, you know, I thought that we were going to learn about the Flint sit-down strike, which we did. I thought we would learn about coal mining strikes. I thought that we would learn about all sorts of things, and we did. But in our textbook, we get to this one chapter, and it talks about the 1913-14 Michigan copper strike. Now, this copper strike took place in my native Upper Peninsula, and I never heard about it. Just like a lot of people, you have history going on all around you, and you don't hear about it, especially if it's history of working people standing up, or it's the history of African Americans standing up, or it's the history of women standing up. So, here I was in this class, and I hear all about the 1913-14 Michigan copper strike. It changed my life. Because suddenly I am hearing about people from my area of the world who were part of a major labor relations war, 1913-14. And I'm going to tell you about that, but I'm going to tell you what made it so famous in a second. But let's look up here. Well, how about I do that? There we go. So I'm from Escanaba. This is the copper country up in the UP. There are iron ranges, the Marquette Iron Range, the Menominee Iron Range, and the Gogebic Iron Range. More copper went out of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan than almost any other region on Earth from around 1880 up until about 1920. We were the major copper producer for the world, okay? And there's purer copper up in the UP than almost anywhere else in the world, the way that it was put together. But because of the fact that you've got 3 different iron ranges and a copper range, miners were a huge part of Upper Peninsula history and a huge part of all of our history. So, up here is the copper range. Now, in 1913, what happened is that the workers had been living in what was really kind of a feudal kingdom. The copper bosses up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan ran the entire copper country as if they owned it, which they, of course, did. But waves of immigrants came in from Finland, waves of immigrants came in from Ireland, Italy, and elsewhere to work up in these copper mines. Now, they prided themselves, the bosses did, that they were nice to their people. But they weren't really nice to their people. They treated them like they were objects and like they were slaves, for the most part, up in the UP. And what happened is that the workers started to organize, and the national president of the union came in, who was based in Denver. He came in and said, guys, you know, let's get everything organized and get ready to go, and maybe next year what we'll do is we'll take some form of action against the company. Local people said, we're not waiting. So in July of 1913, they went on strike. Now they struck for a number of reasons. They struck for wages, just like most workers do. They struck because of the fact that they felt that they were treated like cattle, treated like slaves. And they also struck because of what's right here. That's a strike placard of a one-man drill. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. One-man drills were a problem because of the fact that when you mine copper, you have to drill in, then you lay your charges, you back off, and you blow it out, and then you use shovels and take all of that rock out. That's the way that any mining works: copper mining, iron mining, coal mining. But these drills used to be operated by two people. And the reason that that was important is the workers said, if you only operate it with one person, these guys are off in their own little area and they're drilling. What happens if a rock falls on his head? No one's there to know that he got hurt. And they called these new drills widowmakers. They said the problem with these is these are widowmakers. Now, up in the copper country right now, there's a local brewery that does a black ale called Widowmaker Ale, based on that old notion of those one-man drills. So they struck because of the drill. Now, the reason they struck because of the drill is if you take two men to run a drill and you only run it with one man, half of the workforce doesn't work. And what these workers were out to do is they were out to rise, because most people push these big, heavy carloads of copper ore through the mine until it was lifted out and so forth. That they're called trammers. Now, they knew that they weren't ever going to stop pushing those cars if they couldn't become a miner. So they were worried about their future. Miners were going to be unemployed. Basically, it was a situation that was bound to make people feel scared. Scared economically, scared because of possible physical danger. So they went on strike. They did daily strike parades up and down the center of Calumet. Now, Calumet right now only has probably less than about 1,000 people or so. At one point around this time, the Calumet area had nearly 100,000 people up in the Upper Peninsula because of the fact that the mines were so vibrant. So they had daily strike parades going up and down the streets of Calumet. And then the governor, the day before they even struck, the governor sent National Guard troops into the copper country, because the copper bosses got them on the phone and said, we've got to do something about this strike that's going to happen. So we're very worried that this strike is going to disrupt our little kingdom. And so for that reason, they sent in troops. Every day, they always led the parade with gigantic U.S. flags. And the reason that that's important, and I'll show you a picture later of Lansing, we in the labor movement are more patriotic than almost any other movement in America. We believe in America. We believe very strongly in the American dream. They believed they were part of the American dream, even though they weren't American citizens yet. They were Finns, they were Italians, they were Slovenians, but they believed very strongly in the promise of America at that point, and they believed that a union would help make that promise come true. Now, this is Big Annie. Big Annie Clements was one of the first women inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. And Big Annie, as she was called, was about 6'2", and she was Slovenian, and her husband was a miner, and ultimately they got divorced because I think her husband couldn't take how popular his wife was and what a leading role she was taking in the strike. Because after a few months on strike, the guys got really tired of being on strike. So the Women's Auxiliary took over all of the coordination of the strike lines, taking kids out on the line, not unlike here in Lansing at various times, or in Flint, where kids were on the line with signs that said, "My papa is striking for me." So Annie was one of the flag carriers always at the front of the parade. She was big, and she was handling that big flag. At one point, a Michigan National Guardsman rode her down with his horse, and he put his saber through the American flag, and she wrapped it around herself and said, "Do not hurt this flag. Kill me if you feel that you should hurt this flag." Now, Big Annie became the symbol to many people in Michigan and the Copper Country, and frankly, even across the nation, of the strike. Now, she was a real organizer. She knew how to organize. There you see the kids. Papa is striking for us. And, you can understand when you're in a strike situation, when, you don't know where the money is coming from. You're living in a company house, which means at any point they can evict you if you don't pay rent. Where are you going to get the money for the rent? Because you're on strike. And they could evict you anyway because they own the place. So they were in a situation that was very dire, and they wanted to make sure that everybody understood that when you're on strike, your family's on strike. Not only the worker that's on strike, everyone's on strike. And Big Annie understood that, and that's why they had parades like this one of the strikers' children. Now, this is Italian Hall. This is where the story turned dark in the textbook, and this is where I decided that I didn't understand why I had never heard the story that I'm about to tell you. So, in the day, VFW halls didn't exist yet, but ethnic halls existed. You had a Finn hall, you had an Italian hall, you had a Sons of Slovenia hall. These halls were really important because strikers weren't going to be meeting in the library. They weren't going to be meeting in City Hall. They had to be meeting somewhere. So it was the fraternal organizations based on ethnicity, the Italians, the Slovenians, the Finns, that turned their halls over to strikers. Okay? So Italian Hall is on a major street in Calumet. Calumet had so much money because of the copper bosses, they built an actual opera house in downtown Calumet. Okay? And all of the buildings, not unlike this one, are beautiful red sandstone buildings. So Italian Hall, on the first floor was a bar and a small store. And on the second floor was the actual meeting room. And there it says, whatever of Italia up there on top. The strike dragged on. 2 strikers were killed in a house when mine guards and imported strikebreakers surrounded the house and shot into the house. 2 people were killed. 1 baby was grazed along its face. The violence was very worrisome, and the strike just proceeded, right? you get more and more worried. People started to move out of town. A lot of them moved out to Butte, Montana, where they could also mine copper elsewhere. So the strike continued, and it got into the holiday season. And Big Annie and the Women's Auxiliary decided that they had to do something for the kids. So they decided to have a strikers' Christmas party on Christmas Eve. So they decorated the hall, they made all of the different decorations. They went to local businesses that were pro-strike so that they could get any little thing that they could for the kids, right? Little things that the kids could take away. And they had Santa Claus and they had, trees and the whole thing. Well, they were at the Christmas party, hundreds of people were there, and someone falsely cried fire in the crowded hall on the second floor of Italian Hall. Now the problem is there were a couple of exits from Italian Hall, but only one significant exit, and that was this stairway. This is the Italian Hall, the day after the Italian Hall disaster. So people started running down this stairway, and somebody tripped. And as you can see, some of these doors are external doors. There was an argument for a long time that mine guards had held the doors closed so people could not get out. That was found ultimately to be false. But people piled, as they said in the local paper, like cordwood, and couldn't get out. And they just kept on packing tighter above. So this entire stairway, all the way up to the second floor, became nothing but piled people. 74 people were smothered by being in the crush on the stairs. 59 of them children. One family lost 3 kids at Italian Hall. Okay? The next day, the bosses said, "We will give you money for the funeral." And the national president of the mine workers came in from Denver, and he said, "We will not take your money." A day after he said that, armed men wearing masks came into his hotel room, shot him, probably accidentally, while they were dragging him from his hotel to the railway station, where they threw him on a train, and they told the conductor, "Don't let him off until Milwaukee." Okay? So basically, he was shot in the back, ended up in a hospital because of the fact that he told the bosses that the workers would bury their own dead. Well, the coroner said it was so eerie because of the fact that they just kept on bringing kids out and placing them in various open places. I think this was actually in the Opera House. They started just bringing the kids out. And the coroner said it was so eerie because it was like they were all sleeping because of the fact that these kids had simply been crushed and smothered on the stairs. And like I said, one family lost 3. The funeral, when it happened, was huge. So they buried most of them. There were 2 different cemeteries, you can imagine, a Catholic cemetery and a Protestant cemetery in Calumet. But they made huge kind of open graves for all of the little white caskets with the kids and for the other adults. One of the largest parades in the history of the Copper Country, of course. Now, Italian Hall was torn down a few years ago. So when you go to Calumet, all you can see This is the original. That arch is above this doorway. So they saved the arch, and it's now become the only memorial in Calumet to the fact that this tragedy happened. Okay? Now the strike went on. The strike went on from July of 2013. The strikers were still out, and finally the strike was ended in April of 1914. So it went on for a long time. Big Annie moved with her husband to Chicago. Many people moved out of the copper country, either west to other mining regions. Some of them were able to get into some of the iron mines in Michigan, which were still fairly vibrant. Some came down here and became auto workers in Detroit, because the fact that Henry Ford was taken off with his company in Detroit at that time, and in 1915 would, declare that if you kept your nose clean and had all sorts of things correct as far as Henry Ford was concerned, you could get $5 a day for working in the auto plants, which was regarded as revolutionary in 2015. This is what sent me into the labor movement, because I realized that no one ever taught me anything like this in school. You hear all about the people who run American industry, but you don't hear about the workers. You hear all about presidents, generals, all sorts of other great people, but you don't hear about workers. And you don't hear about union leaders. You don't hear about people who act up. Or as John Lewis, the congressman who died a couple years back, said that you have to get in good trouble. People who organize get in good trouble. But I decided, based on this, that I had to dedicate my life to working in the labor movement, because someone needed to represent these folks, and someone needed to tell the story. Someone needs to be able to tell people that something happened here that was significant. Now, this happened a long time ago, and it happened far away. Now I'm going to turn around and talk about what happened here and why you're important as auto workers. Okay? But before I do that, any questions? Have you ever heard of the 1913 copper strike? No. That amount of people dying at Italian Hall? Right? Well, now you can tell others about that story too, and you've got handouts to back it up. I want to talk about the auto industry. Now, any questions about that or comments on our friends up in Calumet? I depressed you so much you won't even be able to eat lunch, I know, right? It's going to be tough. No questions, no comments? Brother Diedick, anything?
No, just that this is, the bigger picture. This is what plays into what we're doing, even though, without that foundation, a lot of the contracts we have today wouldn't exist. So, that's why I say history will repeat itself if we don't pay attention. And these are the things, the safety standards, that these folks that died in those stairwells, and there's stories like that all over the place.
And none of those workers knew that they were going to make history. None of us knows when we're going to make history. None of us knows that today is going to be our day where we make a mark, right? All they were trying to do is stand up so that they could get a proper wage, that they could get job security. And then they end up, in this case, in the history book. Now, let's go to the auto plants.
Excuse me, how long did that strike last? 6 months, you said, the copper strike?
No, it lasted nearly a year. So it was from July of 13 until April of 14, so that was a long time. It was my strike. When we had paper workers, we were out for 6 months.
Oh, okay.
So.
Did they finally get a second man for that Widowmaker?
What's that?
Did
What the contract ended up doing was giving them a slight increase. The contract actually worked out so that they would put a boy, don't you love that? Child labor. So that they would put a boy with everybody running a one-man drill rather than a second man, okay? So you utilize some of the kids in the mines rather than their parents. And the other thing that they didn't recognize the union. They demanded that all the workers had to turn in their union cards to be able to continue to work, blacklisting a number of people who didn't want to give it up, and a lot of those folks went to other places that were unionized. Now, I have to tell you, there was no union in most of the Upper Peninsula of any longevity in any of the mining regions until the late 30s, early 1940s. And then the steelworkers organized miners in the iron ranges, but most specifically in Marquette, because a lot of the other mines had begun to go down. But oddly enough, my hometown, Escanaba, was an iron shipping port. All the ore got shipped out of Marquette. If it was from the Marquette Range, it got shipped out of Ashland, Wisconsin. If it was from the Gogebic Range, and it got shipped out of Escanaba, for the most part, if it was from the Menominee Range. That stuff came across, and we shipped it out. But this is an early assembly line, right? Now, Henry Ford gets all the credit, and he doesn't deserve it. Henry Ford didn't invent the assembly line. R.E. Olds invented the assembly line. Olds, the father of Rio, the father of Oldsmobile, he invented the moving assembly line, or at least the assembly line notion of laying things out by parts in bins and everything else, a kind of a systematic way to build cars. Ford gets all the credit, which is unfortunate. But back in the day, this is what an assembly line looked like. And, you know, you could be certain that a lot of these didn't fit, you know, so you'd try to put one in, it wouldn't fit, you'd drop one on the floor. It was a very frustrating kind of time to be in production, okay? A lot of speed up. The boss would stand behind you and really kind of hit you with things that fell on the floor, back of the head, just to keep you frisky. But these auto plants ultimately created enough dissension that people started to organize. The first people that organized in auto actually organized, the first plant that was organized was a Studebaker plant in Indiana. And it was organized by the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a radical union. So that was organized during World War I. Didn't last long. But here in Lansing, we have a really unique history of what it means to be an auto worker. So let me say a little bit about Detroit versus Lansing, or even Flint versus Lansing. So in Detroit, a lot of the people who worked in the plants in Detroit lived in the neighborhood of the plant. They walked to work, okay? They walked to work. Those folks, when Henry Ford built Highland Park, which was the first major modern auto plant in around 1915, many people in the surrounding area were African Americans who had moved up from the South, or they were other immigrants who had moved into Detroit. So they would walk to the Highland Park plant. When he built the Rouge, which you drive by on I-94, the Rouge at one point had 100,000 people in one location working in the Rouge. One of the largest industrial workplaces in the history of the world. And Ford, when he started building cars at the Rouge, decided that he wanted to build everything that went into the car. So he had glass plants making his own glass. He had lumber mills up in the Upper Peninsula shipping pieces down for the bumper, and other parts of the frame of a car were wooden, and that wood was coming down from the UP. He tried to actually start rubber production in Brazil so that he would own his own source of rubber. But he instead worked with his friend Henry Firestone, who actually had the Firestone tires, and they were very, very good friends, so he simply worked off the Firestone stuff. But what makes Lansing different is Lansing, especially when REO Ransom E. Olds started Oldsmobile. Ultimately, he sold it to General Motors, and then he started Rio. His workers often were around the plant, but a lot of them instead were farmers. So we had a workforce here in the Lansing area that farmed before they came to work and farmed after they got off shift. So they were running real live dairy farms, or they were running real live places, soybeans, corn, you name it. And they had a worker farmer kind of mentality, okay? So Lansing was always different than what it meant to work in Detroit. And much more of kind of a family feel in Lansing by comparison to feeling that everybody was in it together. The Rio Company had its own clubhouse where workers would go. I mean, there were a variety of things that made Lansing a lot different than either Flint or Detroit. Now, that story is important in a minute. So, that's the auto assembly line as it became, where you were moving the cars down. And that's what one looks like today, right? So a lot cleaner, I mean, it's amazing what an auto assembly line looks like in this moment. Now, what we did a few years ago to tell the story of Lansing workers is I helped, but the inspiration came totally from the workers. But then they asked my help, and I was happy to help them. So what we did is the Verlinden plant, as it was called. Remember when the old Verlinden plant was up? Fisher Body, that was over here.
Fisher too.
That plant didn't have a new product that was going to go into it, so they decided that they would take it down early and replace it with the Lansing Delta Township plant, which they did. LDT, which you can see out on the expressway. The problem is they had a gap. They had a gap of about a year when they weren't going to be making cars. Luckily, in the UAW contract at that time, they had a provision called the Job Bank. So, Job Bank workers would basically show up at locations where they were warehoused, where the workers, many people came in and knitted, other people came in and read, other people came in and played games, but a number of people who were in the job bank used their time to to work for local charitable organizations. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, the Salvation Army, various groups. They would be loaned out from the job bank to all of these different Habitat for Humanity, you name it. At Local 602, which represents the people at Verlinden and then at LVT, they had one person on their education committee who said, you know what we should do? We should start a history project since we have so much time on our hands. So they made a decision that they wanted to be trained, so I was lucky enough to be one of the people that trained them. We trained the history committee at Local 602 in how to do oral histories. And over the period of that closure, before the new plant opened up, they did around 125 oral history interviews with line workers, local union officials, plant managers, supervisors, and neighbors who had grown up in the shadow of the plant. So they did all of these oral histories. We let them at MSU, we let them borrow recording equipment so they could do those interviews, and we sponsored the training. That set of interviews ended up, we got a grant, and it's all repositoried at the MSU library. And at the MSU library, we have something called the Lansing Autotown Gallery. Now, put that down, circle it on their paper. When you get home, put that in your Google Drive, Lansing Autotown Gallery. What will happen is it'll take you to the MSU Library website, where all of those oral histories are kept. All of the recordings are on the university's library website. So you can listen to all 125 recordings of workers talking about what it was like to work in the plant, what it was like to lead the local union, what it was like to be a supervisor, okay? Then they decided that they would collect things to go with that. So at one point, the history committee was over here and they were tearing the plant down. Management dumped thousands of photographs from the plant because they had an internal plant newsletter, so they just dumped all of these photos. Our folks picked them up, and so they put all of those photos. If they had an individual interviewee, like for example the former president of the local at that time, Doug Rademacher, there were pictures of Doug working on the shop floor, so they linked those to his interview. Other people would bring in other objects that were important to them, so they took pictures of hard hats and lunch boxes and other things that people had. And then, somebody at MSU in the art department thought this was so cool he couldn't stand it, right? So he decided that he would take pictures of everybody who was interviewed, if he could grab them, okay? So these are all workers. That's Doug Rademacher, who's the president of local. And I'm sure that Edith might remember some of these people's names.
Dorothy Stevens.
Dorothy, who is the head of the Women's Committee at 602. But what my friend Peter Glendenning did is he took pictures of all these folks, and he put those pictures on the website along with their interviews. And he also did a major museum exhibit of those photos, and they've really done extremely well. Well, before I go on, those interviews were used to create a exhibit on Latinos in the auto industry because about 8 of the people who were interviewed were Latino. They've been used by countless students and scholars writing about the auto industry because of the fact that it's open, and you and your kids can listen to those interviews anytime you want to just by going to that Lansing Autotown Gallery. We added all of the oral history interviews that had been done by a historian at Michigan State, Lisa Fine, who did a book on Rio, and other oral histories were all added to this Lansing Autotown Gallery. So we continue to kind of muscle build with it and make it bigger and bigger. And it's hosted on the MSU site, and it's there to stay. And it's our way at MSU of making sure that we're telling the story really of why Lansing is important and what has gone on here. Now there's another reason that Lansing is important, and that is what happened in this town in 1937. Now let me take you to 1937. All of us talk about the Flint sit-down strike, right? So the Flint sit-down strike was unbelievably important. It started in 1936 and ended up in 1937. It's often called the 37th strike for that reason, even though it started in 36. It was the first major concession by the auto industry to a union. The original UAW contract was simply 2 sides of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. The most important thing that it said in 1936 for the auto workers was that no additional cuts would happen. You have to remember, this is the Depression, right? So one thing that was happening is that cuts were continuing to be made on people at this time. So they simply wanted everything to remain the same and for the company to recognize the union, and that's what happened. Now, while that was happening in Flint, that was a real inspiration to people here in Lansing. So at Rio, which was here in town and was a very vibrant maker of automobiles, they ended up with a 6-day, sit-down strike, and they were able to get the company to say yes to a union and build power. But the local president was a guy named Lester Washburn. Now Lester Washburn, and by the way, he ended up, there were 2 UAWs back in the 1930s. There was the UAW, American Federation of Labor, and the UAW, Congress of Industrial Organization. What happened is that one was a little more conservative than the other. The UAW-CIO is what became the current UAW. The UAW-AFL became something called the Allied Industrial Workers, which had locals here in town for a long time. Lester Washburn ended up being an AIW rep and I think vice president. But back in the day, it was the UAW-AFL that organized that sit-down strike at Rio. Because of the fact that so many people got what was called sit-down fever, so many people got fired up about organizing unions. In Detroit, the diner workers sat down in the diner and refused to serve people unless they had a union. There were sit-downs in a variety of different kinds of workplaces. So a local business called Capital City Wrecking wanted a union, so Lester took them out on strike, and a judge turned around and said that they couldn't strike, and the sheriff was sent because Lester refused to take down the pickets. A judge said that he was in contempt of court and sent the local sheriff out to arrest Lester. So they showed up at Lester Washburn's house at 2 o'clock in the morning. Lester was in Detroit meeting with the rest of the UAW on other stuff. They couldn't arrest Lester, so they arrested his wife, took his wife out of the house at 2 o'clock, leaving their 3 kids home alone. They had very small children at the time, home alone without either parent. And Lester comes back early in the morning the next day, and not only was his wife arrested, but a number of other people connected to the picket line and arrested connected to the union were arrested. So they're all in jail. Lester comes back and said, "This will not stand." So Lester took the entire city of Lansing out on strike. He said, "We cannot allow our local officials to be arresting my wife, let alone all of these other pickets." He said, "We will not allow it to happen." So, the way that they struck is they took cars, including this semi, and they parked up the entire downtown of Lansing, Michigan. So that truck, you can see the Bochi Tower there, right? I think that's right across Michigan Avenue. They parked up all of Michigan Avenue for blocks and blocks from the state capitol all the way down to past where the convention center is now. They parked up Capitol Avenue, they parked up Washington Avenue, and they went door to door saying to the businesses, "Don't you think you shouldn't be operating today?" And sure enough, they closed down the entire city of Lansing. The governor, good guy, good Democrat, Frank Murphy, who had interceded in the Flint sit-down strike. Frank Murphy comes back to town after he's been out of town, calls the people in to his office, and negotiates an end to this general strike. Now, general strikes don't happen much, okay? Shawn Fain has called for a general strike later this year or next year, but they don't happen much. In history, when they have happened, often they're violent. It's not a good thing. Here in Lansing, and by the way, most general strikes are not successful. Here, we had a one-day, peaceful, successful general strike. The workers won. Capital City Wrecking ended up with a union contract. All the people, including Lester's wife, were let out of jail, and the workers went back to work. Now, as you can see, when you park up a street, it's going to slow things down. This is workers. That's a city capitol right there. So they're on the steps of the Capitol. I'm going to get to this picture. This is a picture looking down Michigan Avenue from the steps of the actual state capitol. Look at all those workers, right? Flooded the entire place. Now, one thing I will say, not unlike our friend Tall Annie, always American flags. There, not a single picket sign, nothing but American flags, right? They didn't have time to make picket signs, right? But we decided, given the fact that, I've always said to people as an organizer, never let a good anniversary by. You always have to, if you have a good anniversary, just go for it. So what we did in 2017, we decided to hold a birthday celebration for the Lansing Labor Holiday. Now, the way that we did that is we decided that we would create a historical marker. Now, historical markers have to be okayed by the state of Michigan. And there's an office that okays those and everything else. You have to raise money. UAW was nice enough to pay for the marker, about $4,000. And we actually had a celebration downtown right where the Lansing Labor Holiday had happened. So we were right in front of City Hall. We had people from the Allied Industrial Workers, since it had been their local. We had UAW speakers. We had a variety of people. And we decided that we did films, we did all sorts of things to commemorate the fact that this had gone on. And we did this poster, 1937 to 2017. Oh, come back. And this is the marker. Now, go over and see it, because it's your marker. It's your labor movement. The marker is right in front of City Hall, right across from the state capitol. We wanted it right there, so every legislator that goes across that street has to walk by a marker that talks about the Lansing Labor Holiday, that talks about the might of working people. Now,
Is it on the
workers
Capitol lawn
continue-
or City Hall lawn?
What's
City
that?
Hall- Is it on the City Hall property or?
It's on the City Hall property.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's actually another historic marker for the city of Lansing, state marker, and then there's our marker, which is right there.
So they gonna move into the new city hall building, they're tearing that one down.
Yeah, well, we're probably gonna have to move it. We'll probably talk to the state about moving it on to the actual Capitol grounds, since that's historic there. I mean, history's always a struggle, right? You always have to figure out how you tell the story and how you get others to support you in telling the story. I bet no one ever told you about the Lansing Labor Holiday before right now, right?
Heard about it from my grandfather.
Really? Great. That's wonderful. Had he been there?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, and you know, it's one of those things that otherwise what happens is we end up with amnesia, right? It's like, never happened, right? Never happened. Well, so now you know that you've got a library resource to go and find out about auto working in Detroit and Lansing and the history of the plant here. You can go and see the marker because this is your history. Any questions on any of this before we take a break? Any questions? You like this stuff?
Yeah.
Wish you heard it in high school? Yeah. I wish you did too, right? Well, let's take 15, right?
Sure.
And come back and eat all that good food. And thank you for filming.
Thank you.